They say history is written by the victors, but when it comes to D-Day, Hollywood has taken the pen and rewritten it into a story of glory, clean victories, and choreographed heroism. In film after film, we see young men sprinting across the sands of Normandy like warriors from a legend, bullets flying around them yet somehow missing, all set to swelling music and slow motion frames. But the real story, it is darker, it is heavier, and it is far more human. June 6, 1944, did not begin with a heroic charge. It began with silence. The cold, gray dawn over the English Channel was not a trumpet blast to battle, but a grim prelude to chaos. The young men on those landing crafts were not hardened warriors. Many were teenagers who had never seen war. Some had never even traveled outside their hometowns. What waited for them on Omaha Beach was not cinematic glory. It was machine gun fire so thick that it tore through entire platoons before their boots touched the sand. Within minutes, the water turned crimson. Men drowned under the weight of 60 pounds of gear before enemy bullets could even find them. Others never made it off the boats. There were no dramatic speeches, no gallant trumpet calls, just the roar of gunfire, the screams of the wounded, and the desperate push forward. What the movies rarely show is the sheer terror etched into every face, the paralysis, the confusion, the hopelessness of seeing your friends fall one by one, and knowing there was no choice but to keep moving. But this is not just a story about suffering. It is about endurance. It is about what happens when ordinary boys are thrust into an extraordinary hell and still choose to fight. Tonight, or wherever and whenever you are listening, I invite you to take a quiet journey back in time, not to the polished scenes of the silver screen, but to the muddy trenches, the bloodied beaches, and the haunted eyes of real soldiers who lived and died on the path to liberation. So get comfortable, pull up that blanket, adjust your headphones, and let your imagination walk barefoot across history. And if you find value in stories like this, raw, real, and often overlooked, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Every click helps us bring forgotten moments back to life and honor the voices that history nearly silenced. Now close your eyes, listen closely. This is not the war you have seen in movies. This is what it was really like to fight in Normandy. The story of Normandy did not end on June 6, 1944. In fact, the nightmare had only just begun. What Hollywood often wraps up in a final, victorious shot, the raising of a flag, the cheering of liberated towns, was, in reality, only the first few painful steps into a long and brutal campaign. D-Day may have opened the door to France, but the path through it was jagged with resistance, drenched in rain, and paved with an unimaginable cost. The Normandy campaign dragged on for 85 grueling days. It was not just a beach landing. It was a slow-motion grind through hedgerows, muddy fields, and fortified towns. Nearly 500,000 people, soldiers and civilians alike, would become casualties before it was over. The landings had been violent, yes, but what followed was something different, something worse in many ways, a relentless, exhausting struggle, where front lines moved slowly, if at all. For the Allied troops who had survived the chaos of Omaha and the other beaches, the next challenge was just as terrifying, pushing inland through territory that was unfamiliar, hostile, and rigged to kill. The hedgerow country of Normandy, with its thick earthen walls and twisting lanes, became a sniper's paradise and a tank commander's nightmare. It was the perfect terrain for ambushes, for mines hidden beneath the soil, for sudden death, to leap out of the greenery. And the German forces had no intention of retreating without a fight. Far from the crumbling empire depicted in some accounts, the German army in Normandy was well trained, battle-hardened, and ruthlessly determined. They counterattacked with precision, dug in behind every hedge and stone wall, and made the Allies pay dearly for every village, every crossroad, every inch of ground. The town of Caen, for example, which was originally slated to be captured on D-Day itself, took over a month to secure. When the Allies finally took it, they found not a symbol of victory, but a landscape of rubble, ash, and broken lives. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened by aerial bombardment, leaving civilians trapped or buried beneath their homes. The price of progress was not just paid in soldiers' lives, it was paid in the destruction of towns, in families torn apart, in the quiet agony of those who survived the storm only to live among its ruins. For the men on the ground, time became a blur. Days bled into nights. Sleep came in snatches, if at all. Rain soaked through their uniforms, mud clung to every step, and the thunder of artillery never seemed to stop. Letters from home arrived sporadically, often bringing joy and sorrow in equal measure. Some soldiers read of newborn children they had never met. Others received news of loved ones lost, and all the while they pressed forward into places with names like St. Lo, Vire, and Falaise, names that would be etched into their memories by fire and blood. It was not just the physical toll that broke men down, it was the psychological weight of it all, watching friends fall, burying them in makeshift graves, only to move on without time to grieve. Facing an enemy who knew the land better, who had prepared for this moment for years, and who seemed to rise again no matter how many battles were won, the sense of progress was painfully slow, and the cost often felt too high. Yet somehow they endured. By late July, the Americans launched Operation Cobra, a massive breakout from the hedgerow country that finally began to turn the tide. But even that success brought its own horrors. Entire German divisions were encircled and bombarded from the air in what would become known as the Falaise Pocket. The roads were so choked with bodies, both human and animal, that advancing troops reported the stench as unbearable. Vehicles had to weave through a landscape of carnage just to move forward. Victory had never felt so grim. Still, there was something else rising from the wreckage liberation. As Allied forces pushed farther, French towns began to reclaim their freedom. Children emerged from basements, waving flags that had been hidden for years. Old men cried in the streets. Women wept as tanks rolled past. And though the soldiers did not always see themselves as heroes, for those who had lived under occupation, their arrival was nothing short of salvation. By the end of August, Paris would be liberated, and the campaign in Normandy would officially come to a close. But the price had been staggering. Nearly 500,000 people had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. The rolling hills of Normandy, once quiet pastures and farmlands, had become vast cemeteries, some marked by white crosses and names, others by wreckage and silence. The Normandy campaign was not the swift liberation that planners had envisioned. It was not a tale of flawless strategy or cinematic triumph. It was a war of attrition, the slog through hell, fought by men who were cold, tired, and afraid, but who kept going anyway. So when you think of D-Day, do not let the story end at the beach. Remember what came after. Remember the 85 days that reshaped Europe, not just with bullets and bombs, but with sacrifice, resilience, and the hope that one day the guns would fall silent and the world would be free again. Many American soldiers never even made it to the beach. As their landing craft approached the shore of Omaha, a storm of bullets and shells rained down from fortified German positions high above the coastline. The steel ramps of the Higgins boats dropped with a loud clang, and for many, that sound was the last thing they ever heard. Within seconds, entire groups were cut down by machine gun fire before they could even step into the surf. The water quickly turned a dark, horrifying red, churning with bodies, gear, and shattered hopes. Those who leapt over the side in desperation found no safety there. Laden with heavy packs, rifles, and radios, many soldiers sank beneath the waves, pulled down by the very equipment they needed to survive once on land. Some managed to shed their gear in time, but in doing so, they lost critical tools, ammunition, communication gear, food, and medical supplies. And yet, even unarmed and vulnerable, they swam forward, driven by duty, fear, and the knowledge that turning back was not an option. The chaos was indescribable. Smoke and fog from the early morning bombardment lingered over the water, blurring vision, masking obstacles, and disorienting soldiers. Many were landed far from their assigned sectors, their units scattered and mixed. Officers shouted conflicting orders or were killed instantly upon disembarking, leaving stunned privates leaderless and terrified. The tide pushed bodies and broken landing craft back and forth like flotsam, offering no mercy, no time to regroup. Meanwhile, the German defenders, veterans of years of hard fighting on other fronts, held the advantage of elevation and preparation. They had spent months fortifying the cliffs and slopes of Normandy with machine gun nests, mortar pits, anti-tank guns, and layers of barbed wire and mines. And despite the massive Allied air and naval bombardment that preceded the landings, many of these defenses remained intact. Worse, some had been concealed so effectively that Allied intelligence had completely missed them. Those who made it to the shingle, the sloping stretch of gravel and sand just below the main seawall, found themselves pinned. There was no cover but what debris they could crawl behind. Some huddled behind the corpses of fallen comrades, unable to move forward or backward. Time seemed to stretch as seconds felt like minutes and minutes like hours. Every breath could be the last. Every motion drew fire. It was not just the Germans they were fighting. It was the sea, the cold, the fear, the uncertainty. Communication broke down. Radios were drowned, cables severed, runners killed. Plans carefully crafted in briefings were useless now. Chaos had replaced strategy. Yet in this chaos, something extraordinary happened. Small groups began to act on instinct, courage, and raw determination. A sergeant with a handful of men would push forward, crawling, ducking, flanking a machine gun nest from behind. Engineers blew gaps in the beach, obstacles under fire, clearing the way for tanks that mostly never arrived. Medics dragged the wounded through sand and surf, often getting shot themselves in the process. The beach was a crucible. Nothing about it resembled the heroic imagery often portrayed in films or propaganda posters. There was no triumphant charge, no sweeping victory. It was inch by inch, yard by yard, paid for with blood and resolve. There were moments when it seemed the assault might fail entirely, that the Germans would throw the invaders back into the sea, but still they pressed on. By late morning, some units had established toeholds at the base of the bluffs. Using explosives and sheer willpower, they scaled cliffs, assaulted pillboxes, and silenced the guns that had decimated their brothers just hours before. Slowly, very slowly, the tide began to turn, not just the literal tide, but the momentum of battle. The Germans, stretched thin and surprised by the scale of the assault, began to falter. Not everywhere, and not all at once, but just enough. By nightfall, Omaha Beach had been secured, but at a staggering cost. Thousands lay dead or wounded. The beach was littered with twisted metal, burned-out vehicles, and the echoes of unimaginable suffering. The silence that fell over the shoreline that evening was not peaceful. It was stunned, shell-shocked, haunted. Survivors stared at the sand, at the water, at each other, unsure whether to feel relief or guilt. The story of Omaha is not one of cinematic heroism. It is one of survival, of resilience in the face of total disorder. It is the story of ordinary men, barely more than boys, thrown into an inferno and somehow pushing forward when everything screamed for retreat. It is about the cost of freedom, not just in numbers or territory gained, but in the human toll it exacted from those who dared to land on that cursed stretch of French coast. And it is only the beginning. The horror of the beach was only day one. What followed was a brutal 85-day slog through hedgerows, towns, and villages, each step forward met with resistance, ambush, and attrition. The battle for Normandy was not won on the beach, but in the days and weeks that came after, when those who survived had to keep fighting, keep moving, keep believing that it would all be worth it in the end. Tommy Miller had never seen the ocean before he joined the Army, At 19, the furthest he had traveled from his family's farm in rural Ohio was to Cleveland. Yet now, as the dark waves of the English Channel rocked the massive landing craft beneath his feet, he stood shoulder to shoulder with dozens of other young men, all waiting for the ramp to drop. They wore the same uniforms, carried the same rifles, and bore the same unspoken weight fear masked by silence, anticipation draped in fog. The morning air was thick with diesel fumes and salt, and the sky had barely begun to lighten with the promise of dawn. The only sounds were the churn of the engines and the occasional cough, each one sounding louder than it should. Tommy clutched his M1 Garand like a lifeline, the cold steel biting into his gloves. Around him, men shifted nervously, some whispering quiet prayers, others staring straight ahead, their eyes already lost to some other place. No one talked about what lay ahead, but they all knew the name, Omaha. Tommy's pack weighed almost as much as he did. Ammunition, rations, entrenching tools, extra socks, and a gas mask were all strapped to his frame with military precision. The load pressed on his shoulders, pulling him down with every wave that rocked the craft. Training had drilled into him the importance of readiness, how to hit the beach, find cover, return fire. But now, standing at the edge of something unknowable, Tommy realized that no amount of drilling could prepare a person for the reality of war. A sergeant barked a command. Helmets lowered, grips tightened. Tommy felt his heart hammer in his chest. Then came the distant thunder, not the rolling, lazy kind that came with Midwest storms, but the sharp, sudden burst of artillery. Shells screamed overhead, crashing into the surf and sand beyond their sight line. The craft's ramp began to lower. Time collapsed. Tommy saw the flash before he heard the explosion. Water erupted beside them, spraying cold salt and shrapnel into the boat. Someone screamed. The ramp hit the water with a splash, and suddenly the world was noise and fire. Men surged forward into the surf, but Tommy hesitated, frozen for a heartbeat too long. "Move, Miller." The shove came from behind, snapping him into action. He stumbled forward into the chaos. The water hit him like ice, rising past his waist in an instant. Bullets churned the sea, zipping past him, thudding into the bodies of men around him. Some went under, dragged down by the weight of their gear. Others struggled to keep their rifles dry, fighting to stay upright against the pull of the current and the rain of lead. The shore seemed impossibly far away, and the tide relentless. Tommy trudged forward, every step a battle. His legs ached. His breath came in ragged gasps. He looked, left a friend from training, Donnie, fell face first into the surf, non-moving. "Right," another man screamed as he clutched his shoulder, blood pouring out, staining the waves crimson. The beach loomed ahead, but it was not salvation. It was worse. The sand offered no cover, only more chaos. Craters from shell fire dotted the shore, and bodies lay motionless or curled in pain. Machine guns raked the beach from the cliffs above, their chatter unending. Artillery pounded the earth, tossing debris into the air like confetti at a grim celebration. Tommy hit the sand hard, crawled forward, and rolled into the first shallow depression he could find. The world around him exploded in fragments, noise, screams, heat, and fear. For a moment he closed his eyes and pressed his face into the wet sand, trying to will himself invisible, but he knew he could not stay there. He opened his eyes and raised his head, scanning the beach for movement. A lieutenant was waving men forward, pointing to a stretch of wire that had already been blown open. "Go, go, go," the officer shouted, his voice raw from overuse. Tommy moved. Every inch felt like a lifetime. He crawled, ducked, paused, ran. He saw men who never made it past the tide. He saw medics trying to help others while being targeted themselves. He saw bravery and terror sharing the same space in the eyes of every man still moving forward. By the time Tommy reached the base of the cliffs, he was shaking, not just from exhaustion, but from the sheer sensory overload. His ears rang, his hands were scraped raw, and his uniform was soaked through, but he was alive. and around him, others had made it too. They regrouped in small pockets, finding shelter behind burned-out tanks or debris. Orders were shouted. The push inland had to continue. The beach had been hell, but it was just the beginning. Beyond those cliffs were hedgerows, villages, and more fortified positions. Omaha was not a single battle. It was a doorway into a long and brutal campaign. As Tommy looked back at the surf now littered with debris, bodies, and broken dreams, he felt the weight of what they had survived. But there was no time to grieve, no time to process, only time to move forward. He was not just a farm boy from Ohio anymore. He was part of something larger, something painful, chaotic, and impossibly human. He had landed in Normandy, not to become a hero, but to survive and to help others survive. And somehow, in that unthinkable place, amid the thunder of war, a 19-year-old carried more than a rifle. He carried the burden of history. The moment Tommy Miller's boots touched the shifting sands of Omaha Beach, time fractured. Every second stretched like an eternity, each breath a gamble against fate. Around him, the world was a roar of noise and fire whistles of incoming mortars, the metallic shriek of bullets tearing through air, the dull thud of bodies hitting surf and soil. At 19, Tommy had never seen death. Now it surrounded him in every direction, faceless, relentless, indiscriminate. He did not run, not yet. First, he crawled. Salt water clung to his uniform as he scrambled forward on all fours, his M1 Garand slick with ocean spray and trembling fingers. The weight of his gear pulled at his shoulders, 60 pounds of hope and fear strapped to his back, while wet boots sucked into the soft sand with every dragging motion. There was no time to look back, though he could hear the panicked screams of his fellow soldiers. Many younger than he was. Some never made it out of the water. Some screamed for medics who would never arrive. Tommy did not scream. He did not have the breath for it. Instead, he focused on a distant point ahead, a jagged concrete seawall, perhaps 30 yards from the waterline. It was salvation and trap all in one. GIs who reached it were momentarily shielded from German fire, but then found themselves pinned down, unable to advance without risking open exposure. Still, it was better than the beach. Machine gun rounds kicked up wet bursts of sand inches from his elbows as he pressed himself flat, crawling like a man possessed. Time lost all meaning in the firestorm. He could no longer distinguish between minutes and hours. When he finally slammed against the cold cement of the seawall, he found himself among a dozen others, their faces caked with mud, blood, and terror. Some crossed themselves. Others vomited. One clutched a photograph of a girl and whispered her name like a prayer. The battlefield had no room for prayers. Orders came swiftly from a sergeant missing his helmet and half his left ear. On my mark, we push forward one grenade first, then rifles. Aim high, move fast. Don't stop unless you are hit. If you are hit, crawl and shoot. You stop, you are dead. Tommy nodded, though the words barely registered. All he could think about was his father, who had survived the trenches of the Great War, and his mother, who had packed him peanut brittle and a letter he had not yet opened. He wondered for a moment if she would ever know where he fell. But then the sergeant yelled, "Go!" and the wall of bodies surged forward like a living tide. They ran not upright like in the movies, but low and desperate, zigzagging through broken tank traps and craters filled with the remains of others who had tried before them. Tommy hurled a grenade toward the base of a bunker, the pin slipping from his trembling fingers as he ducked behind a mound of sand. The explosion that followed was both muffled and deafening, and he used its cover to scramble forward again, rifle raised. He reached the base of the bunker in seconds that felt like decades, pressing his back against the cool stone as a torrent of bullets chewed the air where he had just stood. His hands moved mechanically, slapping another clip into the rifle, then swinging around to fire into the narrow slit of the German position. He did not see if his shots hit, but the gunfire stopped. Another GI, face bloodied and uniform shredded, joined him beside the concrete. "You, Tommy, the man asked breathlessly. Tommy blinked. Yeah. They said you are the runner. Get to the top, signal the rest. There was no time to argue. The path upward was a narrow slope of mud and barbed wire. Tommy ran no plan, just motion, and somehow reached the top. What he saw would never leave him. The beach below was a painting in red and smoke. Bodies lay tangled in metal, gear scattered like confetti, while explosions pocked the ground in every direction. And yet, amidst the carnage, men kept coming, boat after boat, wave after wave they came. He turned back toward the German position and raised the flare gun he had been handed in the boat. One shot into the air green, safe to push. As the smoke trailed skyward, more Americans began to surge forward, encouraged by that small flash of color in a sky stained with battle. Tommy dropped the flare and slumped behind a ridge, his chest heaving. The weight of survival was beginning to settle on his shoulders. For the first time since his boots hit the beach, he felt the full magnitude of the task ahead. This was just the beginning. The hedgerows, the snipers, the push inland. It was all still to come. But for now, he had lived. In a place where so many had not, Tommy Miller of Ohio had lived. And in that moment, surrounded by the thunder of war and the cries of the wounded, he realized that survival was not victory. It was merely another chance to keep moving forward, while the beaches of Normandy erupted in fire and steel. Another war unfolded in the shadows, miles inland, under the cover of darkness. Well before the first landing craft hit the shore, the sky above France roared with the sound of aircraft engines. Hundreds of planes streaked across the night, carrying paratroopers into the unknown. Among them was Private First Class James Cooper of the 101st Airborne Division, a young man from rural Kentucky who had never seen Europe before and now found himself suspended beneath a parachute, descending toward a land he would only studied on maps. The jump was never going to be clean. The pilots, flying low to avoid flak, were already under immense pressure. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the night sky like hellish fireworks, bursting around the planes in blinding flashes. The jump signal came abruptly, and within moments, men leapt into the dark, their parachutes opening above scattered fields, orchards, and hedgerows of the French countryside. Cooper did not know it then, but his unit had been badly scattered. Some dropped miles from their intended zone. He landed hard, his equipment digging into his side, his rifle tangled in its sling. All around him, chaos. No sign of comrades, no commands, just the distant hum of engines retreating and the uncertain whisper of wind through the hedges. Alone, disoriented, and undertrained for what was unfolding, Cooper lay still in a ditch for nearly half an hour, waiting for any sound to guide him. A flare shot into the sky miles away, briefly illuminating the rolling farmland. He heard German voices not far off, their boots crunching through gravel and underbrush. He held his breath, the fear thick enough to taste. This was not how war looked in the recruitment posters. This was survival, stripped bare. In the hours that followed, Cooper moved low and slow, crawling through fields and ducking behind stone walls. Every noise made him freeze. Every silhouette looked like the enemy. The quiet was more terrifying than gunfire, because it left room for imagination, and imagination, in the dark, is a dangerous thing. Around dawn, he finally stumbled upon two other paratroopers, one from his own regiment, the other from the 82nd. They did not exchange pleasantries. They simply nodded and formed a plan, find their way to the causeways that led to the beaches, disrupt German reinforcements, and pray they lived long enough to matter. Their progress was agonizingly slow. The Normandy countryside, with its narrow lanes, stone farmhouses, and endless hedgerows, became both refuge and trap. German patrols moved methodically through the area, and snipers watched the roads. Cooper and his companions avoided direct conflict whenever possible, but they could not always escape it. At one point, they stumbled into a firefight near a barn. Gunfire erupted from the second story, and the men were forced to crawl through a ditch, returning fire when they could. The air reeked of gunpowder and damp earth. When it was over, 2 Germans lay still, and Cooper was down to his last 2 magazines. The war was only a day old. They rested briefly in the barn, eating whatever they could find, mostly cold rations and water from a rusted canteen. Cooper found a French farmer's family hiding in the cellar. The father had once fought in the Great War and, in broken English, thanked Cooper with tears in his eyes. It was a moment that cut through the fear, a brief reminder of why he was there. The 3 paratroopers continued moving by night. They marked trees with chalk, whispered passwords flash and thunder, and kept their eyes low. They encountered more lost men, growing their group to a dozen by the second night. A scattered army, improvised and unsupervised, bound by instinct and desperation. Their radios did not work. Maps were vague, but each small action, disabling a communications post, ambushing a convoy, sabotaging a bridge, contributed to the larger chaos that the Germans could not contain. And that ultimately was their mission. Cooper's most terrifying moment came on the 3rd night, near the town of Carentan. They approached a German outpost positioned near a crossroads. The plan was to wait for the cover of rain to slip past it, but the weather held clear. Then, a misstep. A rifle clattered against a stone. Instantly, spotlights snapped on. Machine guns opened fire, and the night turned into a screaming hell. Bullets tore through the hedges, and Cooper dropped behind a ditch, returning fire blindly. He saw one of the men, a kid named Duffy from Illinois, go down, hit in the chest. Another was hit in the leg, and they had to carry him for miles before finding shelter. But the group did not retreat. They pushed on. By the end of the first week, Cooper had linked up with elements of the 502nd. They had taken several villages and helped secure a route for armor, moving inland from the beachheads. His uniform was stained with mud and blood. His eyes, once wide with the fear of a new soldier, now bore the 1,000-yard stare of experience. He had not slept properly in days, but he had survived. The experience of Cooper and his fellow paratroopers was not one of cinematic glory or well-scripted heroism. It was marked by confusion, isolation, and raw courage. They were not just soldiers. They were ghosts in enemy territory, forced to adapt, improvise, and endure in ways that no training manual could ever prepare them for. Behind every successful landing at the beaches, behind every tank that rolled into Normandy, there were men like Cooper clearing paths, sabotaging resistance, and fighting inch by inch in the hedgerows. In the quiet that followed, Cooper would often think back to that descent through darkness. He remembered the sound of the wind in his parachute, the thud of landing, the fear of being alone in a hostile land. And he knew that the real story of D-Day was not just written on the beaches, but also in the fields, forests, and villages of Normandy, where scattered paratroopers turned disarray into determination and chaos into victory. Of all the unexpected challenges the Allied forces faced after the initial landings, none proved more treacherous or frustrating than the Normandy hedgerows. These ancient, tangled barriers of earth and vegetation known as bocage lined the fields of northern France like natural fortresses. To the untrained eye, they seemed innocuous, even picturesque. But to the soldiers fighting inch by inch through the countryside, they became a green labyrinth of death, where every step forward was a gamble, and every bush might conceal the barrel of a waiting rifle. The story picks up after the smoke on the beaches had begun to clear. After young men like Tommy Miller had crawled through sand and fear, survived the mortar fire and machine guns, and pushed inland with aching legs and hearts pounding. Victory on the beaches was just the beginning. What came next was not a sweeping advance into open terrain, but a brutal crawl through a suffocating patchwork of fields, fences, and killing zones. The hedgerows in many places stood taller than a man and were too thick to see through. Built up over centuries by farmers, these embankments were made of earth, reinforced with thick roots and topped by shrubs and trees. They absorbed gunfire and artillery blasts, and they offered perfect concealment for defenders familiar with the terrain. Paratroopers like Cooper, who had already endured the chaos of a nighttime drop behind enemy lines, now found themselves navigating a world where visibility was limited to a few feet ahead. His unit had regrouped by luck and determination, moving silently through villages and past barns to link up with advancing infantry. Now, in this new stage of the campaign, they were assigned to push forward across what should have been open country, but instead felt like navigating a deadly maze. German forces, particularly elite paratroopers and panzergrenadiers, had taken up positions behind hedgerows with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons. The Allies, advancing through narrow gaps and overexposed roads, were easy targets. Tommy's squad learned quickly that each field had to be treated like an enemy compound. First, they would scout the corners. Then they would send someone up to toss a grenade over the hedge, hoping to clear any defenders. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it did not. Once, during a quiet afternoon advance, they crossed into a seemingly empty pasture only to be met with machine gun fire. From a barn camouflaged by thick vines, they lost 2 men before retreating. The next morning, they tried again, this time with tank support. Even then, the tank struggled. The hedgerows acted like barricades, too high to drive over and too strong to smash through. It was not until enterprising soldiers began welding saw teeth onto tank fronts, so-called rhino tanks, that the armor could break through and create new paths. The environment itself played a cruel game with their senses. Fog rolled in and out. The sun could be shining 1 minute and vanish behind clouds the next. Insects swarmed in the heat. The sound of a twig snapping could either be a fox or a sniper. And the smell. Always the lingering odor of earth, smoke, and something worse, something human. Men became paranoid. Sleep was shallow. Food was cold. Movement was slow. And yet, there was no choice but to press on. Every day, they fought to gain another 100 yards, another cluster of houses, another village name that would later be etched on memorials far from that place. For Cooper, the fields were as dangerous as the skies had been. He led point more than once, checking for mines and tripwires, signaling his squad to stop when he spotted suspicious shapes. He saw men break down, not from wounds, but from the endless pressure, the sense that every hedge might be their last. And he watched as seasoned fighters adapted, grew hard, became tacticians out of necessity. By late July, some units had started to master the terrain, using smoke, coordinated artillery, and new tactics to flush out defenders. The front lines moved, slowly but surely, but it came at a terrible cost. Historians would later note that the fight through Normandy was not defined only by D-Day itself, but by these weeks of grinding, small-scale combat, where victories were measured in meters. The hedgerows turned the war into a series of personal duels, of silent hunts and sudden firefights. For Tommy and Cooper and thousands of others, it was a test of endurance as much as courage. They had landed expecting one kind of war, only to find another entirely. The fields of Normandy demanded everything: patience, skill, and above all, the will to keep moving forward, hedge by hedge, until the enemy line finally broke. Muller had not slept in 3 days. His uniform, once crisp with insignia that inspired pride, was now stained with sweat, dirt, and smoke. Normandy was unrecognizable. The quiet villages he had marched through months earlier now lay shattered by artillery. Trees split open like wounds, homes leveled into rubble, and fields once vibrant now burned black beneath a sky permanently clouded by gunpowder. Every step he took felt heavier, not just from exhaustion, but from the creeping certainty that the war, at least in this part of the world, was slipping beyond his country's control. He was a sergeant from Saxony, 31 years old, hardened by years of service on both the eastern and western fronts. Normandy, however, was proving to be something entirely different. Unlike the vast open steppes of the east, this was a battlefield of hedgerows and hamlets, where every field, every barn, every twist in the road could be a death trap. The Americans were relentless. The British were methodical. And the French resistance, once only a whisper, had become a dagger in the dark. For Muller, survival had become a minute-by-minute calculation. The retreat was not orderly. It was a patchwork of staggered units, many of them cut off or out of communication, using outdated maps and whispered rumors to navigate. His orders were simple. In theory, delay the Allied advance, hold the line wherever possible, but in practice, it meant staying one step ahead of being overrun. He and his men found themselves falling back through a labyrinth of hedgerows. These ancient walls of thick earth and dense foliage were not just obstacles, they were the battlefield. American troops had learned quickly how to use them to their advantage, moving silently between the gaps, setting up machine gun nests in hedgerow corners, launching surprise attacks that vanished. As quickly as they began, Muller lost half his squad in one such ambush. It happened in seconds. One moment they were crawling toward a farmhouse thought to be abandoned. The next, they were under fire from two directions. Screams, smoke, silence. The days blurred. Each village they passed through carried the same scene: crumbling buildings, terrified civilians hiding in cellars, roads cratered by bombs. But what struck Muller most were the faces of the farmers and old women they encountered. Some looked at him with pity, others with silent hatred. He could not blame them. In one shattered town, he found himself standing beside a collapsed church, where stained glass shards lay scattered among the stones. He watched as a pair of children carried water to a wounded American under the watchful eyes of their grandmother. Muller did not stop them. What was the point? There were more important battles now than interrupting kindness. His own rations had dwindled. Ammunition was limited. Fuel for the remaining transport vehicles was almost gone. The Luftwaffe, once feared, had become a rare presence overhead. He would gone days without seeing a German aircraft. The skies now belonged to the Allies, whose bombers pounded the roads behind him and strafed columns of fleeing trucks. Muller had learned to move only at night, but even then, safety was an illusion. The men around him had changed. Gone were the confident boasts of victory. Conversations became hushed, short, focused on basic things: where to find water, who had extra socks, whether that distant gunfire meant another Allied push. Some spoke of surrender in quiet tones, but others warned that such words could lead to a court-martial or worse. And yet, there were moments, rare and fleeting, where Muller glimpsed something resembling hope. Not for victory, but for survival. One afternoon, after days of retreat, his unit stumbled upon a small orchard hidden by a thick grove. There were apples, real, fresh apples. He and his men sat beneath the trees, eating in silence, the sunlight breaking briefly through the clouds. It was a moment he would remember long after the war, a reminder that the world could still offer beauty, even here. But peace never lasted long. By nightfall, Allied artillery had found their position. They were shelled without mercy. He lost 2 more men. Another, a 19-year-old from Munich, collapsed into a trench, sobbing uncontrollably. Muller said nothing. He just sat beside him, offering a flask of water. By early August, the Allied breakthrough near St. Lo shattered what little coherence remained in the German lines. Muller received orders to fall back again, this time toward Falaise. But it was already too late. Encirclement loomed. Rumors swirled of entire units being trapped and annihilated. Roads became clogged with fleeing troops and abandoned equipment. Horses, trucks, tanks, everything jammed into chaos, all trying to escape the tightening noose. The men no longer fought for territory. They fought for the slim chance of reaching the Seine alive. As Müller marched through yet another ruined village, he passed the body of a young German soldier, helmet missing, eyes open to the sky. No one had the time to bury him. His rifle lay at his side, untouched. Müller paused for a moment, not out of sentimentality, but as a quiet act of acknowledgement. He did not know the boy's name, but he saw himself in the stillness, an echo of what this war had done to all of them. Behind him, the thunder of Allied tanks grew louder. Ahead, the roads narrowed, and the field stretched into the unknown. There was no glory left. only the instinct to keep moving. Even as the guns fell silent for brief moments, the war continued in the minds of those who fought it. Tommy Miller, now a few days into the campaign in Normandy, had changed. Gone was the wide-eyed teenager from Ohio who had trembled on the ramp of the landing craft. In his place stood a young man moving mechanically through orders and actions, driven not by heroism but by necessity. He had not slept properly since the morning of the invasion, and what little rest he did get came with vivid dreams, none of them peaceful. He often jolted awake to the imagined sound of a whistle, the metallic clang of a falling helmet, or worse, the voice of a friend who was not there anymore. All around him, others were slipping too. Private Dawson, a joker just days ago, now stared blankly at nothing, lips moving without sound. Sergeant Hill, steady as bedrock on D-Day, suddenly snapped during a patrol, convinced they were being watched, though the hedgerows were still. The lines between reality and fear blurred rapidly in these fields. Across the battlefield, a young German named Müller was facing similar shadows. Stationed on the outskirts of a small village, his unit had been falling back each day. Trading ground for time, they slept in barns, moved at night, and fought in unfamiliar terrain. Müller's boots were worn through, and the rifle he carried felt heavier with each hour. He had not eaten anything warm in days. But the weight pressing most heavily on him was not physical. It was the constant, gnawing dread. The Allies were coming. He could hear the distant rumble of tanks, even when they were not there. His mind, like the roads of Normandy, had become cluttered with broken thoughts, craters of despair, and tripwires of guilt. He remembered the young American he had seen through his scope 2 nights earlier, no older than himself, hesitating as he climbed over a hedgerow. Müller had aimed but could not fire. Something about the moment, perhaps the way the soldier looked behind him, as if asking permission from a ghost, froze Müller's trigger finger. He had not told anyone. He doubted he ever would. Both Tommy and Müller, on opposite sides of a war neither had chosen, now fought invisible battles. And they were not alone. In the days following the landings, medical tents quietly filled with men who bore no external wounds. One soldier stood outside a medic station for 3 hours, unable to speak, gripping a broken watch in his hand. Another walked straight into a field under fire, unaware of his surroundings, mumbling the name of his hometown. These were not rare incidents. They were daily occurrences, quietly managed, rarely acknowledged. Commanders did their best to keep morale up. Letters from home were handed out carefully. Simple comforts, a cigarette, a can of soup, a dry pair of socks were hoarded like treasure. But these could only go so far. What truly haunted the men was not just the fear of dying. It was the unrelenting uncertainty. When would it end? Would they ever return home? And if they did, who would they be? Tommy found himself asking that question more with each passing hour. He still wrote in his notebook when he could, a habit he would picked up from his father. But the words had changed. What had started as wide-eyed accounts of landing crafts and beachheads had turned into fragmented thoughts, bits of poetry, quotes he half remembered, the names of friends he did not want to forget. On one page, he had scribbled, "This war is not just between nations, but between the man I was and the man I am becoming." Even the natural world seemed to reflect the tension. Birds no longer sang near the front lines. The wind carried more smoke than fresh air. Rain pooled in shell craters, turning fields into graves of memory. The Normandy countryside, once beautiful, now felt like a vast, surreal painting, one in which time had slowed, and sorrow seeped into every brushstroke. Müller, too, had stopped writing home. There were no words to explain this place. His last letter sat unfinished in his pack, beginning with Mother. "I am alive," but trailing off after that. He carried it with him, not knowing why. Maybe, he thought, it was a way to keep a piece of himself tethered to something real. In rare quiet moments, there was a strange, shared understanding between enemy lines. Not in words, of course, but in gestures. One night, as a firefight ended and silence reclaimed the fields, Tommy thought he saw a flicker of movement, just a shadow pausing at the edge of a barn. Neither side raised a weapon, just a pause, a breath. Then the shadow was gone. And with that, the war resumed. But for a second, the human cost of all this, the confusion, the exhaustion, the way it reshaped young minds, stood above tactics and flags. These soldiers, pushed to their psychological limits, were not just players in a historic campaign. They were individuals, each carrying the weight of noise that never ended, of silence that spoke louder than commands, and of memories that would follow them long after Normandy. For many, the battle would not end when the war did. It would echo in dreams, resurface in quiet dinners, and linger in the eyes of those who returned home changed. In Normandy, courage was not just facing bullets. It was waking up another day, gripping a rifle, and walking forward despite the heavy fog inside the mind. Of all the moments that defined the Normandy campaign, none perhaps turned the tide as dramatically as the Allied breakout in late July 1944. It came after weeks of exhausting combat, through the bocage country fields, boxed in by tall hedgerows that turned every advance into a brutal test of nerve and endurance. By then, men like Tommy Miller, who had clawed his way up the beaches of Omaha, and Cooper, the paratrooper who had dropped into chaos behind enemy lines, were no longer fresh-faced soldiers. They were hardened by fire, molded by the grinding pace of battle, by the endless suspense of not knowing whether the next step would be their last. And the enemy they faced, like young Muller, a conscript pulled into a war he did not start, was running out of time, supplies, and hope. Operation Cobra was not just a shift in tactics. It was a psychological shift in the rhythm of the war. For weeks, the Allies had fought inch by inch, stalled by terrain and stubborn resistance. But the breakout would finally unleash the momentum they needed. It began with a thunderous aerial bombardment. Thousands of planes roared overhead, dropping tons of explosives onto German positions. Just west of St. Lo, the ground shook violently. Even from miles away, soldiers could feel the tremors in their boots. Some American infantrymen, lying in shallow foxholes, covered their ears and eyes as dirt and smoke choked the skies. The bombardment was a signal, a prelude to a storm. When the earth finally stopped quaking, the infantry surged forward, tanks pushed through gaps blasted in the hedgerows, while weary riflemen followed closely behind. For the first time in weeks, the enemy's line buckled. German units, fragmented and stunned by the overwhelming force, struggled to mount organized resistance. Many had already endured weeks of sleepless nights, constant shelling, and dwindling reinforcements. Mueller, whose division had held the line near the town of Marigny, recalled later how the sky seemed to split open and how his comrades scattered, some running blindly, others frozen in disbelief. The Allied advance picked up speed, and with it came both chaos and liberation. French villages, long silent under occupation, erupted into scenes of jubilation as tanks rolled through narrow streets. Civilians emerged from cellars with tears streaming down their faces, offering flowers and bottles of wine to soldiers who looked like ghosts, dusty, sweat-soaked, hollow-eyed. Tommy, now a squad leader, accepted a warm loaf of bread from an elderly woman who whispered, "Merci, mon fils." He barely understood the words, but he felt their weight. Not all was triumphant. The breakout exposed the brutal cost of the hedgerow campaign. Fields were still littered with wrecked Sherman tanks, scorched earth, and the remnants of men who had not made it. Cooper, finally reunited with his surviving paratroopers, walked past a crater where a friend once stood. The offensive had moved on, but the memories clung tight. As American and British forces fanned out across Normandy, they began encircling the retreating Germans. The Falaise pocket, a cauldron of collapsing resistance, began to form. Trapped and desperate, German troops tried to flee through narrow escape routes, but the Allied noose tightened daily. Muller, carrying a wounded comrade on his back, saw the countryside burn behind him. Vehicles were abandoned, weapons tossed aside, officers barking orders no one could follow anymore. By early August, it was clear the German front in Normandy was broken. The mighty Atlantic wall had crumbled, and the road to Paris now lay open. For the men who survived from Omaha's bloody sands to the dark thickets of Carentan and the rolling fields beyond St. Lo, the breakout was not just a tactical success. It was a breath of air after nearly drowning. But it was also a reminder of how much had been paid for each mile gained. Tommy would write to his mother days later, describing the sudden change. "We are finally moving. Not walking into death anymore, but chasing something victory, maybe, or just the end of it." And in the shadowed forests on the German side, Muller, dragging his feet toward the Seine, wondered how long he could keep running before history caught up. Of all the medals, banners, and battlefield honors that war might offer, for many soldiers trudging through the mud and blood-soaked fields of Normandy, survival alone became the only triumph they dared hope for. As the weeks dragged on from the first moments of D-Day, when men like Tommy hurled themselves through surf and shrapnel toward Omaha Beach, to the shadowy hedgerows where paratroopers like Cooper tried to regroup under the cover of night, the price of every forward step became painfully clear. The men did not fight for glory anymore. They fought simply to see the next sunrise, to hear the next call to move, to know, just for one more moment, that they were still alive. There was no rhythm to the days. Sometimes the battle raged for hours. Other times the silence was more unnerving than gunfire. The sun would rise over wrecked villages and cratered fields, casting long shadows on the faces of soldiers hollowed by exhaustion and grief. Food was scarce. Ammunition sometimes ran low. Letters from home, when they came, were held like treasure, read and reread, until the edges curled. Still, the enemy did not rest. German soldiers like Muller, though weary and battered by the weight of a collapsing front, dug in at each line, trying to hold back what felt like the inevitable wave. Muller had once believed in swift victory. Now he fought only to delay, to protect the few comrades left at his side, and to find meaning in a war that had long ceased to make sense. Even for those not directly in the line of fire, the toll was crushing. Some soldiers began to experience terrifying visions. Men they thought they would buried reappearing in the fog, the sound of distant gunfire blending with imagined voices. Nightmares haunted both the Allies and the Germans, making sleep almost as punishing as wakefulness. One British infantryman reportedly screamed in his sleep every night for a month, always reliving the same moment when a friend had died in his arms. American medics began to report symptoms of what we now understand as psychological trauma, tremors, dissociation, an overwhelming sense of doom. There was no official name for it at the time. It was simply called battle fatigue, though its impact was deeper than anyone realized. The land itself seemed to resist the fighting. Normandy's thick hedgerows turned every advance into a death trap. Each narrow path could hide a machine gun nest or a sniper's scope, and the enemy often seemed to melt into the greenery. Allied tanks could not maneuver freely, so infantry bore the brunt of clearing each hedgerow by hand, throwing grenades into shadows, praying they would not be hit. From behind, inching forward, yard by yard, commanders tried to maintain momentum, but frustration built. Rumors spread faster than orders. Some units were told they would break through any day now. Others heard the Germans were regrouping for a counterattack. Every soldier had learned not to trust time. Only what was directly in front of them mattered. Then came the turning point. In late July, after weeks of grueling combat, the Allies launched a massive air and ground offensive, Operation Cobra. It was designed to finally smash through the hedgerow defenses that had turned Normandy into a nightmare. Allied bombers darkened the sky, pounding German positions with thunderous force, and when the ground assault followed, soldiers like Tommy did not cheer. They simply moved forward with grim determination, stepping over smoking craters, past the wreckage of tanks, past friends who had fallen, toward yet another fight. Muller, caught in the path of the offensive, knew the end was near. He saw entire battalions melt away. Some were captured. Others simply vanished, lost in the confusion of retreat. He and his remaining comrades tried to regroup, but their radios were silent, their orders vague. Morale broke. The once proud Wehrmacht lines began to collapse, not because of surrender, but because they could no longer hold themselves together. For Cooper, who had started this journey by falling from the night sky into a country he did not know, the campaign had turned into a series of blurry days and uncertain victories. He had fought beside French resistance fighters. He had seen friends taken prisoner. He had survived ambushes, shellings, and the constant strain of never knowing when death might come. But now, for the first time, he felt a shift. It was not triumph. It was relief. The pressure that had held his chest tight for weeks loosened. The German line was cracking. And perhaps, just perhaps, he might live to return home. In those final days of the Normandy campaign, nobody talked much about winning. They talked about food. They talked about home. They talked about what they would do when this was over, though most did not believe it would ever truly be over. For men like Tommy, Muller, and Cooper, the fighting had become more than just a military operation. It was a test of endurance, of spirit, of humanity, and through it all, one truth remained constant. In a place where death was always near, the simple act of surviving became the only victory that mattered.